what this means now for your family. Will you no longer take your children back to the UK?
I think it's probably too soon to tell.
When the courtroom doors closed, the whispers stopped being whispers. Cameras froze. Pens hovered. And Prince Harry walked into a moment that would strip away titles, tradition, and protection all at once. This wasn't a royal appearance. This was accountability under fluorescent lights. The second Harry stepped into the witness box, the room changed. Not ceremonially, viscerally. His posture was tight, his jaw clenched, his presence heavy with something far deeper than legal obligation. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was years of resentment, trauma, and rage finally colliding with authority that would not bend for bloodline. From the opening questions, Harry came in hot. His words were sharp, emotional, sometimes blistering. He spoke of privacy not as a legal concept, but as something stolen from him piece by piece. He described a life lived under siege, every movement tracked, every conversation potentially compromised, every relationship turned into content. And when he spoke about the media, there was no diplomacy left. Just fury. Disgusting, he said, summing up decades of intrusion. Not carefully, not strategically, but personally. Then came Meghan. Harry painted his wife as the final proof of everything he had been warning the world about for years. He described how the press turned her life into absolute misery, how headlines weren't just stories but weapons. According to him, Meghan wasn't criticized, she was targeted. And in that courtroom, Harry wasn't just defending a case. He was defending his marriage, his choices, and his decision to walk away from the institution that raised him. The testimony unfolded like a psychological autopsy. Harry spoke of calls he believed were private, movements he never consented to being tracked, intimate moments dragged into daylight for profit. Each allegation stacked on the next until the courtroom stopped feeling like a legal space and more like a pressure chamber. But something else was happening too. As the judge pressed him for clarity, for evidence, for precision, cracks began to show. Harry's hands trembled. His voice wavered. His answers grew longer, more defensive, less controlled. Emotion poured out faster than legal strategy could contain it. For a brief moment, the Duke of Sussex disappeared. What stood there instead was a man unraveling in real time. No royal shield, no palace buffer, just a witness exposed under oath. And that's when the power dynamic shifted. Because this was no longer just about what the press allegedly did to Harry and Meghan. It was about how Harry himself would survive the stand, and whether emotion would help him, or quietly destroy his case. The moment Prince Harry returned to the witness box, the courtroom sensed it. This was no longer just testimony. This was confrontation. Gone was any illusion of calm detachment. Harry's posture was rigid, his shoulders tight, his face set in a way that signaled resistance rather than compliance. From the first exchange, it became clear he was not prepared to simply answer questions and move on. He questioned the questions. He challenged the framing. He bristled at interruptions that, in any other courtroom, would have been routine. For legal observers, it was startling. Witnesses are expected to respond, not rebut. To clarify, not correct. Yet Harry repeatedly crossed that invisible line, stepping out of the role of witness and into something closer to advocate for himself. Each time the judge attempted to steer him back to procedure, the tension escalated. The energy in the room shifted from sympathetic to uneasy. This was emotion meeting authority and refusing to yield. Harry's frustration was unmistakable. Years of resentment toward the media poured into his answers, sometimes spilling far beyond what was legally relevant. He spoke not only of alleged unlawful practices, but of how those practices made him feel, how they shaped his worldview, and how they reinforced his belief that the press had waged a personal campaign against him and Meghan. Meghan remained central to his narrative. Harry repeatedly framed his anger through the lens of his wife's experience, presenting her as the clearest example of media cruelty. He described how headlines followed her relentlessly, how stories multiplied regardless of truth, and how the pressure transformed daily life into what he called a constant state of siege. In his telling, Meghan was not just reported on, she was hunted. But the courtroom demanded more than conviction. It demanded restraint. Instead of short, factual answers, Harry often delivered long explanations, layering context onto questions that required precision. Legal experts watching closely noted the risk immediately. In civil cases, credibility is everything. Calm builds trust. Emotion, when unchecked, can fracture it. And Harry was visibly struggling to contain his. At times, his voice sharpened. At others, it cracked. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and his gaze frequently dropped, as though the weight of his own words pressed down on him. This wasn't rehearsed vulnerability. It was raw, uncomfortable, and very real. During short breaks, the transformation was striking. Away from the stand, Harry's body language softened. His shoulders dropped. His breathing slowed. The edge dulled just enough to reveal the man beneath the prince, someone clearly exhausted by years of conflict, suspicion, and perceived betrayal. But once questioning resumed, the tension snapped back into place. It was a fragile balancing act. Observers noted how often Harry appeared to conflate legal scrutiny with personal attack. Routine requests for clarification seemed to irritate him. Neutral challenges were met with defensiveness. And while his emotional responses were understandable on a human level, they carried consequences in a legal setting where perception can be as powerful as evidence. By the midpoint of his testimony, a subtle shift had occurred. This was no longer just about what the press may or may not have done. It was about how Prince Harry himself was performing under pressure. Was he a credible witness calmly presenting facts? Or a wounded man reliving grievances in real time? The courtroom didn't answer that question out loud. But the silence, the careful pauses, and the judge's measured tone suggested something critical was happening beneath the surface. Harry's passion, once a strength, was beginning to look like a liability. And as the scrutiny intensified, one reality became impossible to ignore. The more Harry fought to control the narrative, the more the narrative began to examine him. The stage was set for the most dangerous phase of all, the moment when credibility itself would be put on trial. As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere inside the courtroom subtly but unmistakably shifted. What had begun as an examination of the press's alleged misconduct slowly transformed into something far more dangerous for Prince Harry. The spotlight turned inward. The question was no longer just what the media had done, but whether Harry himself could be trusted as a witness. Every pause mattered. Every hesitation carried weight. Legal observers watched closely as Harry's testimony moved into fragile territory. He was pressed on details he could not fully recall. Conversations blurred. Timelines softened. Memory gaps appeared, and while such lapses are human, in court they invite skepticism. Harry explained these moments by pointing to the passage of time and the emotional toll of events, but critics noted that explanation does not equal verification. Then came the denials. Harry firmly rejected claims that he ever used the pseudonym Mr. Mischief to contact journalists. He dismissed suggestions that individuals within his social circle had leaked information to the press. Each denial was delivered with certainty, yet often without supporting documentation or corroboration. The court was left balancing confidence against evidence, a dangerous equation for any witness. Observers began to notice a pattern. Harry's testimony leaned heavily on belief, assumption, and personal interpretation. He described how certain articles must have come from unlawful information gathering because, in his view, no other explanation made sense. But courts do not operate on what feels logical. They operate on what can be proven. And this is where the narrative widened, perhaps too much. Harry repeatedly linked press coverage to deeply personal struggles, failed relationships, periods of heavy drinking, emotional instability. In doing so, He appeared to place responsibility for his private turmoil squarely at the feet of the media. While the pain was evident, critics questioned whether this strategy blurred the line between causation and correlation. Meghan remained a powerful undercurrent throughout this phase of testimony. Harry spoke of her as both motivation and proof that history was repeating itself, proof that the press had learned nothing from the past. He framed their legal battle as an act of protection, not just for himself, but for his wife and children. To him, this case was about breaking a cycle before it destroyed another generation. But the courtroom demanded discipline, not declarations. Legal experts warned that by expanding the scope of his testimony beyond the specific articles under review, Harry risked undermining his own position. The more he broadened the conflict into a cultural war with the media, the harder it became to anchor his claims to the precise legal standards required to win. By now, the stakes had shifted dramatically. This was no longer simply about whether unlawful information gathering had occurred. The court was now testing Harry's consistency, clarity, and reliability. Each emotionally charged statement raised the same silent question: was passion enhancing the truth or obscuring it? As questioning continued, the tension in the room thickened. Journalists leaned forward. Legal teams scribbled notes. The judge listened carefully, saying little, revealing nothing. Harry, once confident, now appeared increasingly aware of the scrutiny bearing down on him. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man who had spent his life under observation now found himself facing the most unforgiving examination of all. Not by tabloids, not by commentators, but by the law. And as the day drew toward its close, one realization settled heavily over the courtroom. Prince Harry was no longer just accusing the press of invading his privacy. He was fighting to preserve his credibility, and with it, the future of his case.